Hi, everyone. This is Alexander Fernandez with Video Games Real Talk. I hope you're doing well. Happy New Year. It's the new year. It's 2022, and we've already started the year off with a bang. That is why I'm so happy that we have our guest here today, Michael Metzger. Michael, how you doing? How's everything going over there?
I'm doing great. Yeah, what a year. What a start of the year already. Amazing.
I know, right? Can you believe it? I mean, let me ask you, what is more surprising to you? The fact that we had a huge acquisition from Microsoft and Take Two, or the fact that those two acquisitions put to shame all of last year's acquisitions?
But both are crazy. I honestly I didn't expect either of them. So they both came a little bit at a surprise. There was a lot of rumor about, or some rumor about Activision, but um, those rumors been around for a very long time. And Microsoft making an all cash offer like in the second week of January, that was definitely a surprise.
That's the thing. I think you're right on that. I don't think anyone saw this coming, and the reality is that we had all heard about something like this. I mean, there's always the rumor, the scuttlebutt, as they say in the games industry, but I mean, this really was shocking. I mean, it was huge, especially when you consider the fact that what was it? 4 days earlier, Take Two bought Zynga for 12.5 billion.
Yeah,
Uh,
12.7. Yeah, crazy.
12.7 billion, and for 4 days they were king of the castle, they were king gorilla, as they say. And then Microsoft comes in and says, let me go ahead and show you what tech money looks like. And I think that part right there, you're like, wow, they really are that rich. That's one of those things. So I definitely want to get into these two things here, but before we do that, let's talk about you, Mike. I mean, can I call you Mike first? I mean,
Sure. Yeah.
okay, awesome. Mike, so can you introduce yourself to the audience? Tell them what you do. How did you get here? Take us through your journey.
Yeah, so I'm Michael Metzger. I'm a partner at Drakestar Partner. Drakestar is a global investment bank of about 100 folks across the US, Europe, Middle East, and Asia, advising on M&A deals and late stage financings. The firm covers pretty much all kind of parts of tech and media. I focus specifically on digital media and gaming, and last year was a phenomenal year. Drakestar closed a total of 50 deals, believe it or not. Was a huge step up from the year before, and I was able to close a whole bunch of gaming deals too, a record number of deals as well. So extremely happy in the market with several other deals. Little bit of background. So I've been doing this for the last 15 years. Started in an investment bank. Later got acquired, was a banker at Hula and Loki for a while, and then joined Drakestar now, gosh, about 3.5 years ago. I started my career in operating roles for different tech companies and leading a lot of people, and also wasn't involved in corporate development. And that then later led into investment banking.
So let me ask you something. Were you, you started off operational in tech, and I think that's actually very interesting that you actually have ran a company. I mean, you've been in the trenches, so you understand what the entrepreneur is actually going through, what the management is going through. Were you ever part of, on the operational side, a transaction where your company got acquired, where you were effectively either buying or selling or being bought off?
I was mainly on the buy side. So we acquired a lot of companies and saw it from that lens. And I actually was in kind of a product marketing product for many years, and it actually is not very different to kind of the aspect of investment banking and product marketing. You kind of dream up your products and then you pitch it to a lot of clients, and we were kind of in the B2B space. So you show them a roadmap, you craft a story while your product, your company is amazing. And that's to a large extent what we do for our clients. The companies we represent on the sell side when we're selling a company, we typically spend about a month or so just positioning the company in the best possible way, crafting the story while the company is unique, differentiated today, and has an amazing roadmap. And what's going to come in the future is even more amazing, and also position it for the different buyers. As we know, some buyers focus on certain aspects, others on others. So actually the transition from that perspective was pretty easy.
So let me ask you, what got you into the entertainment side then? It sounds like you were in tech. Were you just always, I mean, was it consumer product focus that got you there or what? And why games?
Yeah, so it had to do a little bit. It started when I co-founded an investment bank. We always felt if you're small, you need to be highly focused. You need to be deep in certain sectors. And my partner at the time had done several gaming deals, and that's now, gosh, like 12, 13 years ago, a long time ago. And we just said, let's prioritize certain sectors over others. And, you know, um, being in LA, Activision, Blizzard is here. A lot of the large Japanese companies have their headquarters here in Los Angeles. Um, Companies started like Scopely, Jam City were growing, and we just felt it's a very good sector to focus on being in Los Angeles too. And then we started to do some gaming deals, and one deal led to the next one, and we kept on focusing on it. And then as I changed firms, kind of the relationships and everything goes with a person, and so kept on building it up, and now worked on a ton of deals over the last 10 years.
So let's look at this. 12 years ago, I mean that's a lifetime, especially in video games when you consider the fact that most people have been working in the video games industry for less than 5 years, 65% to be exact, according to the game developer survey that came out a couple years ago. So you've been in the game of basically investment banks, finance, games, finding financing, M&A. 12 years ago, what was the landscape like? And would you have ever believed it was going to be what was this year?
Yeah, initially it was very different, very much focused by the big publishers, right? It's um, and the first time it got really exciting was when there was a heavy push into mobile, which then resulted into a lot of investment money flowing into it. And then I remember the DNA acquiring MG Moko was kind of the first
That was huge.
headline mobile deal. I think at the time was like a 10 times revenue multiple, and so that was the first kind of major disruption and change in the space, and that resulted into heavy investments and followed to a lot of acquisitions on the mobile side. And what's really exciting, we see now, and then several years kind of investment in gaming to some extent didn't dry up once this whole mobile app store innovation was getting old. A lot of VCs didn't really care much about gaming anymore. And that changed a lot last year and the year before with, well, the gaming market is, larger than any other entertainment segment by a lot. And that's one. And just a lot of deals happening and VCs getting to exits, very significant exits. And what's super exciting about the space is that last year was a record investment in private companies. I think it was around 13 billion. And in Q4, if you look Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 last year, its dollar number steadily increased. And in Q4 last year, we were at an all-time high with over 200 deals, announced deals. Actual deals happening probably was even significantly more, as a lot of investments are not announced till sometimes several months later, but sometimes they're not announced at all. So we're currently kind of building the next waves of the next unicorns and the next major exits, which will happen this year and next year, with a lot of money flowing into the space, the startup economy, which is super exciting to me.
So let's unpack this a bit. The games industry is hot. I mean, the reality is it's 200 billion. That's what we're looking at right now. And you talked about how the VCs basically kind of lost interest after the first crest of the mobile gaming wave hit, and then dissipated. Do you see a direct correlation between the generational change that is taking place between basically millennials, zennials, baby boomers, and Gen Z as the reason why VCs are now interested in this? or is this more of the reality that we're getting a COVID bump? Which one do you think is more true, or is it both true?
It's probably a couple of different factors. The COVID bump for sure helped. Second, um, just getting to exits for some of those segments. Um, that kind of was probably also a driver. Like for PC, for smaller to mid-sized PC console developers, um, a lot of them were bootstrapped. They didn't want to need any money, and but there were also no exits for the longest time. And Embracer probably was one of those companies who just said, "Let's roll them all up. Let's make them all part of a family, and let's work out with structure that's worked for both parties." So there was a massive amount of exits, and then VCs probably saw there's an opportunity there, and was a lot of money over the last 2 years flowing in the PC console segment, which did not happen before. And there's also obviously a migration to going to free to play on those platforms as well, which was new. So that probably was a driver. At the same time, you know, overall the market continued to growing rapidly, and that's what the COVID bump also helped. Um, so probably a combination of all of those.
Okay, so let's get into the real details because people love that, and we talk business out here on VGRT. So at this moment in time, you're a game developer who's still independent, which is of a reasonable size. Like we're not talking about four guys in their bedroom or in my mom's house. We're talking about 100-person studio. Let's say 50-person, 50 on up, independent studio has some reasonable success going on. What should they be thinking right now? What I mean, obviously they're running a good studio, it's happening, but how should they be looking at all of this M&A activity? What would you advise them? Obviously, we're not going to hold you to it, but frame it for
Sure.
them. What should they be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, for once, it's a personal choice. Some of the founders, they started a company to have maybe 30 or 50 people working for them. They love what they do. They don't want anybody to tell them what to do. So, and if it's a highly profitable company, they should just continue to do what they're doing if that's what they like and love. Um, but at the same time, um, games are very volatile. Sometimes a studio brings out a game, it's doing great, and the next title it just looks and feels just the same, and it's not working at all. So it again, it depends a little bit on the personal situation, and that's for the bootstrap companies, the smaller ones or the mid-sized ones, as you mentioned. Um, for a lot of them, people say maybe it makes sense to take some chips off the table and consider joining a larger family that might help with synergies and between the different companies. And the Embracer model is interesting from that perspective. A lot of the payouts, what Embracer did or is doing, is it's not a massive exit at close. It's a very very nice exit at close, but then they also have really long-term earnouts, sometimes 5, 6, 7 years or more, where the new kind of I guess head of the family wants to make sure everybody stays happy and on board for a longer exterior of time. But at the same time, the founders had a liquidity event. They're kind of more or less left alone. And a lot of companies which Tencent acquired, for example, too, that's why a lot of the founders really like that. They still let them operate more or less independently, as long as things are going well. If things are not going well, then any responsible parent needs to look what's going on and try to fix it. But as long as things are going well, they, are more or less left alone. So sometimes founders are afraid that, okay, I'm gonna be acquired by XYZ, and I need to send them weekly reports, and they're gonna micromanage me, and that might be a case for some companies, but for others, that's not necessarily the case. They still keep their creative freedom. They can continue to develop games as they want. So um, it's a good combination of still having a good amount of independence while also, you know, taking some chips off the table and using the money maybe for something else.
So, Mike, let's talk about this idea of earnout because I don't think everyone necessarily understands what that means.
Yep.
Obviously, the idea is like the Microsoft deal that just happened. That's 70 billion pure cash, cash in hand. Thank you for your time. Peace out. But
Right.
the Embracer is more earnout. What does that mean? Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends if the company is listed on the stock exchange or not. If a company is listed on the stock exchange, more or less, the buyer needs to pay what the valuation is plus a premium, anywhere from 30, maybe even up to 50 or 60%. And those deals are always at close. And there's sometimes a mix of cash, like in the Microsoft deal, they say we're going to pay all cash. If you look at the Take Two deal with Zynga, they said, okay, so each Zynga shareholder will get $3 something in cash and $6 worth of Take Two shares. So they will get a combination. When um, Zynga bought Peak Games, which was also a massive acquisition, it was half cash, half stock, but essentially it's all at close. In addition to the numbers that are being announced, a lot of the buyers then sometimes come up with some kind of retention bonuses for key team members, making sure the key people actually stay on and are happy. And when I mentioned, so that's kind of in general public company deals. And that applies if Microsoft would buy a private company. They might decide to pay everything at close or also have some earnout or retention structure on top of that. And the way that works is, let's say somebody offers 100 million and they say you get 50 or 60 million at close, and the remaining 40 or 50 million, taking a typical structure of, let's say, 2 or 3 years, is based on your future performance. And it's kind of, meeting in the middle. Entrepreneurs are often thinking, my games are great, but the games I'm going to launch, they're going to be amazing. That's going to be massive. And the buyer is saying, uh, I would love your next games to be massive and highly successful. And I'm very happy to reward you handsomely for it if it is a case. But if they're a flop and if they don't work, you shouldn't get paid. That's kind of how this whole earnout concept is. It's sometimes based on revenue, sometimes based on EBITDA. And a lot of deals where we work on with the sellers, there's also this retention bonus on top of that. It's kind of just incentivizing team members to essentially stay on. And that could be in form of shares that vest over, let's say, 4 years as part of a public company, or it could be just cash bonuses to key team members just for staying on, independent of how the company's doing. And that could be, a payment after year one, another one after year two, a third after year three, something like that. But that's a lot of private deals. Actually, almost all of the private deals have those earnout component, and it's kind of the bridge a gap again between really what the company is worth now and what the company really would be worth in a year or two if the next games are doing really, really well, to kind of meet in the middle.
So let's go back to that scenario where I'm that 100-person team. Okay, I now understand that I can do an earnout. In today's setting, 2022, January, the world's changed. What do you think is just the reality of a multiple that a developer or that studio should be thinking? I mean, have we reached a standard case now? Or, I mean, have they gone up since, say, last year? I mean, how do you see that?
Yeah, so we published this quarterly global gaming report, and I think you got a copy of that too. If
I did. It's fantastic. Everyone should check it out. That for sure.
Yeah, it's just go on Drakestar website under news. It's you'll find it there. There we looked at all the disclosed deals that happened last year, um, and not all deals have an amount disclosed and a multiple disclosed. So disclosed how much they really paid for. Some of them a lot of the Tencent deals are silent. They didn't want to tell anybody how much they paid for, and also how much revenue or EBITDA the company had. EBITDA is earnings, may or may not be disclosed either. But we looked at a lot of deals, pretty much all of the disclosed deals, and the multiples were from an EBITDA, from a profitability point of view, at close, it was about 7.5 times, and all in, meaning including the earnout, 11 times. And if you look at translate that to revenue, it was about 2.3 times revenue at close and about 3.9 all in. So that's the at close portion in, as well as the earnout altogether. So that's kind of a good range to look at.
So yeah, and from that standpoint, obviously EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, deductions, and amortization is what that effectively stands for everyone out there. Understanding your profitability is one thing, right? Knowing that you're running a profitable enterprise, or else, what are you doing here? The second thing is basically understanding how your revenue basically adds to that, and ultimately how your operations will ensure that you are making money. I'm curious if you're seeing a change in the way the buyers are perceiving companies. It used to be that EBITDA was law. Whatever your EBITDA is, that's what we're going to do our multiple on. Have you seen the behavior changing in the private deals where people are now like, hey, you know what? We just need to get companies. Has it turned into that diamonds really are hard to find and now we just need to find them?
Yeah, I mean, it's so valuation in general. It depends on multiple factors. One is a really important one. Typically, is growth. So, um, if a company has been steady at a certain revenue or EBITDA number for a year, and say we're going to stay the same, going to show the same number for the next 2 or 3 years, a buyer would consider that and apply a very low multiple versus if a company is growing 100% year over year, buyers to some extent just project it out and say, oh, wow, in 3 or 4 years, it's going to be massive. And I need to pay much, much more today in order to benefit from those huge revenues and profits 3 or 4 years out. So generally, that's probably the most important thing out of looking at that. And then we sometimes also look at what's kind of the revenue and profits of the core business, the core games they currently have, and sometimes gaming companies make massive investments in the next title that hasn't launched, and so we kind of deduct that when we look at profitability. Says this is like the core business, and then there's massive investments in a new title, and that's going to materialize. But just looking at that at a snapshot today wouldn't really be fair. So we deduct that. So it's kind of we work with that in general. But what you're saying is true. Is we saw some deals with very high valuations, like Tencent bought Sumo, which again was publicly listed and everything was disclosed. That deal was well above a 10 times revenue multiple. And our understanding is Tencent just wanted to have a lot of capacity, a lot of people being able to work on new titles and willing to pay a huge premium for a company with a large number of developers. And we've seen that with a lot of other deals where companies are truly just looking for talent. So we've seen even a good amount of kind of what's called acqui-hire deals where companies just buy studios, are very interested in studios with, let's say, 100 highly talented people with great experience, and they even wouldn't want them to potentially continue the games they're working on. They said, we would want all of you to work on some of our next generation titles and make very attractive offers to that. So we've seen that more recently, and um, that's very exciting. But at the same time, there's still a lot of, well, like last year in the report, we said the deal value was around 85 billion all in. So that includes the M&A deals, um, the financings of the private companies, the financings of the public companies, like an Embracer, Stillfront, Tencent, They go out in the public market and say, we gonna issue more shares. And then institutional investors say, I'm gonna buy those shares. So the number of shares increase. They then have more cash on the balance sheet and they use that cash to acquire the companies. So that's a third component. And the fourth component was the IPOs and specs that happened last year. And just quickly, that number went from total about 30 billion in 2020 to 85 billion last year. And we think this year we might be looking at around 150 billion for the overall market. So it's a and obviously the Microsoft Activision and Take Two Zynga deal already helps kind of filling up a good portion of that in the first 2 weeks of the year.
Well, and that's the thing is that basically if your numbers are right at 150 billion, that means it's nearly the total value of the global industry just in M&A and funding activities. So what I'm curious about is when you start thinking about the Activision, the Sumo deal, the Tencent Sumo, the Take Two deal, and you start to see how these big deals are coming in, whether it's basically I just need resources or I need talented people, is your guys' forecast or prognosis the fact that this is going to continue to accelerate? And will we reach a breaking point? I mean, at one point, surely there will be no one left to buy or no one left to merge. So, what does this look like, say, 2 years from now? What do you think happens?
Yeah, I mean, I hear a lot that or several people mentioned, look, there are no companies to buy anymore. I mean, we track over 1,000 gaming companies globally and chat with them regularly and advise a good amount of them on deals. So there are a lot of companies still out there, and and some of them might go public, and once they go public, they might still get acquired, like an Activision. Also, stay private. A good amount of them will get acquired. That's one piece, and the second is what we started off on. Why I'm so excited about the space. There's so much more money flowing into the startups, and as you know, the gaming space can be very, very fast. And it's to some extent hard to predict. As for specific studios, they might come up with, a game might launch tomorrow and it might be viral and taking off and could produce several hundred million of revenue within like 6 months. It happens all the time. And with all the funding flowing into space, with new VC funds have been announced and launched, they're all generating the next big successful gaming companies, maybe this year, 2 year, or 3 years. And I continue to, I don't see a slowdown at all at this point. And at the same time, it's also, um, in general, the public companies are trading higher from a multiple revenue and EBITDA multiple point of view than some of the private companies, what private companies get on an M&A deal. So a lot of those deals are accretive, and as the public companies, you know, need to show continuous growth, since Wall Street are also looking at them. Are you flat? Are you growing? What's going on? A lot of them are very much focused on acquiring companies while making that accretive, making meaning the combined new companies. Um, the acquisition is at a lower multiple than what the company is currently trading. So the acquirer benefits from that, and that's kind of
The
keeps
street
on
pays
going.
for it. The street rewards. I mean, you buy lower, then the street says applause, and then you get more to buy
Exactly.
some more. It's a fantastic system. I'm curious on this. Do you see a lot of DCF in your guys' valuation models, or is it primarily just multiples of EBITDA, multiples of revenue? Do you ever run into the DCF model?
We don't do much DCS as
Discounted cash
it's
flow, just for everyone out there to understand what that is.
yeah. I mean, we typically help the companies to come up with projections, or guide the companies, coming up with the projections. But you know, some buyers might look at DCF, but it's in the end, the future growth for those companies, specifically as it relates to launching new titles,
Mhm.
it's very volatile. and it's really hard to really determine. That's why for private companies often the earnout component comes in.
Yeah.
um, I think most buyers look at how do the existing titles work,
Yeah.
how good are they. Buyers are often very excited, specifically in the mobile space, if they see certain titles doing really well, but they're not at scale. They have great metrics, great monetization, great retention. And retention has been much more focused on retention after the IDFA change. And then, some buyers might be really good at user acquisitions. If you look at the deal when Playtika acquires WeWorks size was still fairly modest, and Playtika paid, from numbers we've seen, a huge premium on it. And it's our understanding is Playtika looked at it and says, "Look, we are able to scale up that game very significantly. We're really good at user acquisition. We can make this big, which results in huge revenues and huge EBITDA over the next year or two. And hence, we're willing to pay much, much more today." And they did. So it's kind of looking at the core games. How well are they? How scalable are those? If a buyer really knows how to scale them. So that's another way to look at kind of valuations, how the existing titles are doing, and obviously what's in the pipeline.
So, you brought up Sumo, which I think is interesting because Sumo itself was a work for hire shop. They had original development, they also did work for hire for people, but they also primarily had services. Do you see the battle for services companies starting to heat up now in 2022, especially when you consider the fact that a lot of the major ones are public? Keywords is public, Sumo was public, now owned by Tencent. You have guys like Virtuous raising cash. You have a bunch of other ones coming in there. Does your guys' model now look at what happens to all these services companies that have resources that are getting locked up, and do you foresee a battle for those companies next?
Absolutely. Definitely much more requests for people, for the large publishers and developers, to looking at pure resources, large teams. So that probably wasn't the case 2 years ago. Definitely happening now. Hear it more and more from all the different buyers. Still, the Sumo valuation seemed exceptionally high, considering they didn't have any marquee IP or massive own titles. It was mainly a services business, but just the accumulation of just a lot of really highly skilled developers.
I mean, isn't
In
that the point right
Tencent's
there? That's
right.
it, right? And that's it right there. Because in the end of the day, we talk about IP as though that's the end all be all, but the reality is it's not the IP. As we know, it's volatile. It's the people and the organization of labor that is really defining the value, because there's nothing valuable about any of these companies other than the people. So this is
Sure.
something where, and it's weird because we never thought this way as an industry. 12 years ago, it didn't matter who was in the room. At least that's how it used to come off. I'm not saying that it's
Right.
true, but that's how it felt. But now, I mean, a developer in any part of the world, of any form of organization, has a value, and we can see that on paper. And the reason why I'm bringing this over to you, Mike, is it's not because I want to corner you, but it's just when we really think about how investments in video games work and how M&A works here, it's people. I mean, there's no proprietary technology really. What patents? Who controls the market and the platforms? No one. I mean, so the reality is you're getting organized labor that has the best chance of potentially making a hit. The way I look at this, it's like FIFA. We have teams that maybe one of them will make it to the World Cup. They might actually win the World Cup, but it's not what we're paying for. We're paying for people who have the talent that might just possibly be part of a team, that might possibly qualify, that might possibly win. It's the possibility space that we're being bought for. That's it.
Totally. And that's going back to what we talked earlier about retention bonuses and
Yeah.
earnouts. It's the buyers want to make sure that the key talent is happy, at least for the next several years, until they got to know them better, and then they can come up with other kind of incentive structure. That's why often large amounts are being paid and going to the team and saying, we want to make sure those guys stay. They're very happy. They're super creative and come up with the best possible products.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me ask you something. Right now, we've been seeing major moves from pure play video games companies, right? The industry is there. But now on the horizon, we're seeing tech money. We're seeing this word called metaverse. Are you guys tracking the influx of what they used to call the fangs, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, coming in? I mean, what do you guys make of that? And does the games industry, pure play video games people, do they have to keep kind of look over their shoulder because someone more well deep pocketed, well heeled is coming in?
Yeah, and I mean, we really like that new players coming in, right? That makes it more interesting for us. The more buyers at the table, the better for our clients, getting better offers, and sometimes joining even more well-known companies. And I wouldn't be surprised if other major players, like maybe an Amazon, making a significant move this year. They did a good amount of smaller game developers, some more successful, a good amount of them less successful. Netflix is spending much more effort in the gaming space, which makes a ton of sense to me. They have so much really remarkable IP with all those shows that are really not monetized outside of the regular subscription service. And I think games are such an excellent method for them to monetize those games, but also keep the users engaged. If they, can play a little game for whatever series they watch or in between series, it makes a ton of sense. And I wouldn't be surprised if Netflix is making some major moves this year. Not sure about Facebook, but Facebook is, they launched their Facebook instant messages messaging service several years ago. It was maybe not as well planned as they wanted to, but I think they got the ducks in a row now. They're doing a much better job, and they're talked to a lot of developers who are saying they're working with Facebook on the instant messages, and it's all growing and doing really well. So I look at Facebook currently at least more on the platform side. But on the other hand, the Oculus business, that's where your metaverse also comes in. They've been fairly acquisitive, and they publicly stated that they want to buy a lot of more kind of VR-ish studios to kind of just get more amazing content out there. And with the promise of the metaverse coming, general interest in kind of VR, AR companies picked up. Kind of that's also looking at ways VR was extremely hot, maybe 5 years ago. Don't remember the time now around that. It's like PC developers who said we're working on a VR game. They all of a sudden got funding at crazy valuations, and not much has really changed. And then the funding dried up, and a lot of the VR companies just went under and went away, and saw a lot of more money flowing into the space last year. And with the whole talk and promise of the metaverse, seeing that further pick up this year. At the same time, there's also more VR headsets out there, and it just got better overall too. That's a factor. But talking about that, it's definitely a much more attractive segment, and it kind of a second wave of the VR space.
So let's talk about your industry for a second. Investment banking generally has been, in the more traditional spaces and the more well established spaces. But now with Microsoft coming in and splashing that cash, are you all anticipating or are you seeing a PE, VC, investment bank, everything exploding? Like next thing you know, I mean, you're going to see Lloyd's of London coming in at one point. I mean, if they're not already here. I mean, how are you seeing this, and what does that mean for your sector with now all this kind of interest in the game space?
So it's been a mix. It's saw very little activity from private equity funds. So private equity funds are the Carly's, KKR, the massive funds that typically acquire other companies in the space, often the majority, sometimes all, and then grow them for several years and then sell them. Kind of, they're not as strategic. There was very little interest in the gaming space, I would say, let's say 3 years ago. Blackstone was probably one of the earliest one. They then bought Murka in the social casino side. Carly and I came in, bought Jagex last year. We're not talking to a lot of private equity firms that want to be part of this. They see gaming as a highly profitable business. If companies kind of have some success, it's not like some of the other tech startups where they're bleeding money for a very long period of time. Those companies become highly, highly profitable fast. PE firms love that. So a lot of new entrants, we see a lot of PE deals happening this year where private equity firms buy up studios because they feel it's very attractive. It's a high growth market and the studios are doing great. So that's kind of from our perspective, it's great. We're kind of in the middle between sellers and buyers, and the more buyers are at the table, the more offers we likely get on the deals, and it drives up valuation. So it's in the end, it's good for us, and it's good for the companies that is selling. Um, we also saw in general more advisors coming into the space, advisors that focus on general tech. And then I'll say, well, I now also would like to bank video games, and definitely see that. And a lot of them, are fairly new to it. But, that definitely also happened just because the sector overall got so much more attractive. And, all the advisors are looking at, 85 billion last year, maybe 150 billion this year. It's a massive market and want to have a piece of it.
So let's go back to that developer. I'm the 100-person developer. I've made the decision. I'm like, okay, I'm ready to sell. What's my first move? What do I got to do? Take me through this process so that people understand this is what this looks like. Can you
Yeah.
walk me through that?
So it really depends on the situation. If it's, let's say, a development with really good IP, profitable, growing, um, we feel there's going to be a large number of buyers very interested in it. So, depending how well connected that entrepreneur is, he probably should talk to an advisor like us, or, just to get kind of a landscape who could be interested. Generally, I always advise companies for the CEOs at scale to get to know some of those buyers early on, even if they said, "Hey, I might thinking about an exit in 2 or 3 years." I always think it's helpful for them to know some of the key executives at the large buyers, because it's, as you mentioned, the team, the personality, the fit, telling them, get to know them on a personal level, I think is important, as well as, you know, for the buyers to watch how the company's doing. It's like, oh, wow, they doubled again, or something. So, in general, I advise people to just network. That obviously was much harder the last 2 years with no major conference. And I'm super excited about GDC hopefully happening in March. E3 obviously was canceled, unfortunately. But if the company is growing, profitable, great IP, talking with somebody, what we typically do with them is, as I mentioned before, we spend about a month or so on coming up with a great story, coming up with a great PowerPoint deck that tells the story today, what a company is doing, help them cleaning up the financials, historical financials, working, advising them on the projections. What do they think the next 2 or 3 years will bring? What are some of the new titles? And then if they're about to launch a major title, it sometimes makes sense having discussions before the launch and then potentially launch a title after a deal, or sometimes it makes sense to launch a title ahead if everybody is very confident it's going to be amazing because the valuation might be higher in the end. Um, so it's this whole preparation phase. Sometimes, if the company is sizable, the financials should be audited, and that's just going to take a while. Sometimes accountant needs several months to get that all done.
How important do you think audited financials are from having one of the big four? Do you think it should be a big four? Or does it not matter at that point?
I mean, if it's an Activision deal, a massive deal, going with the premium brand is probably great. For a lot of the mid-sized companies, deals between let's say 50 and 200 million, like it should be a well-established brand, but the tier below sometimes is not only cheaper but also much faster, more efficient. So, from our perspective, a global reputable brand is important, but it doesn't have to be a top four.
And then when you look at basically the due diligence process, obviously financials are number one. They need to be done well. What do you advise for your clients for preparation for, obviously there's a data room. What type of documents should they be ready to do? What type of questions should they be ready to do? It's just so that, it's not just, hey, I'm selling my company, deal's done next week. There's
Right.
there's a process. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we help them in the preparation phase where we're really not having any discussions yet. It's again the story, the deck, the financials. The data room is kind of all this. They need to collect all the historical, if there was funding rounds, contracts with vendors, all this kind of stuff needs to be collected, and we work together on the companies doing all of that and getting all of this done before we have active discussions. And a lot of deals we had, we typically then reach out to 40 or 50 buyers. And when we sold Extra de Zynga was around that number. When we worked with Firefly Games out of the UK, who are known for the Stronghold franchises, we ended up selling them to Devolver Digital. Um, Often companies already have some inbound interest that says, look, this publisher keep on pinging us. They would be very interested. The two or three others too. So typically they already have some inbound interest from people where they have built up a relationship or worked with in the past says, we would be very interesting, you joining the family. But at the same time, we reach out to, all the other folks that have been very active and where we think make a great fit. And we typically come up with a list. We work through the list with the founders, and the founders sometimes say, I hate this company, I would never want to work for them. It says, okay, they're out, we're not going to contact them. Um, and we typically have the initial discussions with the buyers, tell a little bit of story why the company is exciting, and then the buyers typically say, this is very exciting. We let's sign a non-disclosure agreement and then set up kind of a management call where they hear the stories from the founder. So we typically prep the founder, work through the kind of the management presentation. That's in typically like a 30-minute to 60-minute kind of Zoom call where the founders walk through the deck and there's a lot of Q&A back and forth to get also a better feeling of the people. And it's amazing the last 2 years that there have been no face-to-face meetings. Pretty much none of the deals we've done did the buyer ever meet the seller in person, but they're still willing to write massive checks and it seems to be working just fine, which is very impressive. Um, but after that round of kind of getting to know the company, hearing the stories from the founders, buyers typically have more questions, and but at some point we ask the buyers to provide an offer, an indicative offer initially, so saying, hey, we're thinking about offering 50 million plus another 50 in earnout, or 100 million at close or more. And it's sometimes also interesting. We saw a wide range of offers, like the best offer to the lowest offer, and some of the deals was a massive margin. And then once we know what the different buyers are thinking, we sit together with the founders and say, look, this is the offers we got, indicative, and let's pick our top two or three parties, and that could be obviously what they're thinking to initially offer, to brand and fit. When we worked with Fresh Planet out of New York, they were known for the song pop franchise. When Vivendi made an offer, one of the largest global media companies, that had more weight than maybe somebody else even paying a little bit more from a much smaller developer. So it's a combination of who would I really enjoy working for? What's kind of the brand of a buyer? If I'm an entrepreneur and I sold to Google, for example, that might really help me raising money for my next company or something like that. Two, what's the actual offer? So it's a combination of that, and we typically narrowed it down to the next, the top two or three, and then we typically negotiate a lot of the deal points from, deals sometimes have escrow. Most of them has escrow where a portion of the money is set apart for a period of time. There are reps and warranties where, you know, um, if the seller does any misrepresentation, didn't disclose something, what happens then? So a lot of those points are negotiated, and we negotiate those early on before we pick the finalist. And then essentially a term sheet is signed where we say we stop discussions with all other parties for a period of time. We typically try to keep that period fairly short. A lot of our deals close from that period where we signed this term sheet to close have been around 4 weeks, and um, and that's a period of time where the buyer does much more diligence, looking at all the details, often interviews a team, to us partnering with a law firm on the seller side as well as the law firm on the buyer doing all the stock purchase agreement, or it could be an asset deal, depends how it's structured, negotiating all of those, going back and forth. And in most of those cases, we're like right in the middle of it and making sure it happens in a very timely manner. Sometimes we need to give an extension by a week, where it says, okay, we're willing to extend the exclusivity by another week to get this really done. But in most of the cases, it's very fast. And I see it all the time when an entrepreneur is not working with an advisor who can be a little bit more assertive. It's sometimes a little bit of good cop, bad cop. The entrepreneur working for the buyer later, you know, probably wants to be the good guy. And, we can sometimes push a little bit harder. We see this all the time when entrepreneurs don't have an advisor and often don't really know how those M&A processes work, where this diligence period is dragging out for months after months after months, and they're staying in exclusivity and they didn't negotiate it right. And and sometimes those deals then fall apart after many, many months, which is very unfortunate. Um, so we always push to keep this exclusivity period short. Also, in a scenario where, for whatever reason, the buyer gets cold feet because they discovered something major, or the company might have not disclosed something very significant, then we can switch horses very quickly. We can go to the number two and says, "This is your lucky day. It's you have a shot to getting it. You initially, and then work with kind of the backup buyer to get a deal done very quickly."
So let me ask you something. From start to close, overall process, is there an average timeline that you're looking at? Is this a 6 month, 3 month, 2 quarters? What are we talking about here?
So we typically say for companies that are very attractive, meaning they're growing in the gaming space for studios, at least they're profitable. It's, a lot of the check boxes apply. We say typically it's 4 to 6 months, um, from us engaging to closing. The fastest deals I've ever worked on was when we sold Ouya, which was a next gen gaming console.
I remember
Sold
that.
them, sold them to Razer. That took us from beginning to end 2 months. That was very, very fast.
Wow.
But Ouya was also under a lot of pressures from the debt holders. The debt holders were pushing us like, guys, we need to get a deal done quickly.
Yeah.
Um, to the deal with Extra de Zynga also happened really fast. It's less than 3 months from beginning to end. But typical deals, I would say, 4 to 6 months.
So, as the entrepreneur basically goes through this process and understands, is there a moment in time that you've generally seen where the entrepreneur finally gets what's happening? Because there's always the excitement, and then there's the realization of you used to be free, now you have a boss. Do you see that moment, or is that something that comes way after and you're like, peace out?
It typically comes after, and the time when we're involved, it's typically always a real roller coaster.
I bet.
So almost every deal we work on, kind of once you go into exclusivity and you have those 4 weeks, every single deal the buyer finds an issue, and it's either the company didn't disclose it or it's not an issue at all, but the buyer thinks it's a big deal, and we all think, oh, the deal is dead. We're not moving forward. It's and then every deal we need to work through it, walk through the buyer. So this is a situation. This is how we got there. This is how it can be mitigated. Typically, when the period when we work with them, and that's also where the entrepreneur often really wants to work with an advisor because it's very stressful, and you have somebody to strategize with. What should we do when we always kind of having done that so many times? We can calm them down a little bit. Say, look, this happens in every deal. This is we'll get through that. So the period when they work with us, it's typically fairly stressful. It's a roller coaster. And then once a deal is done, we get our part of a deal. We get paid. The founders get paid, and we obviously stay in touch with the founders. But it normally then settles in. Okay, they do have a boss and so on, but it's typically we're not involved, at least on a daily basis anymore, with the company at that point.
Let me ask you, in terms of drama, is that 4 week period the most dramatic part of this? Is that where you see, I mean, excuse my language, but people lose their shit? Like just absolutely like
It
this is when
is
you
very
know this is it?
it is very stressful. It's kind of before when the offers come in, it's a lot of excitement. Where are people going to come in? Who's going to offer what? But that's often more like a very positive excitement. So kind of anticipation, nervousness. When are they going to provide an offer and how much? But the really stressful part is getting through the diligence. And a lot of entrepreneurs said this is has been the most stressful period of my life. So it's typically fairly stressful.
I can imagine it's also where you see the tantrums and basically the this is not going to work type thing going down.
And that's also where we sometimes help. We have situations where our client says, "This is total bullshit. I'm done. I'm not moving forward. This is they don't get me." And then if they talk to the buyer directly and the buyer hears that, the buyer might then say, "Oh, maybe you're right. This is not the right deal." But then, we often then talk our clients through it and say, "Look, I know you're upset. This is not ideal, but in the big picture, you also need to look at all the other things." And then people calm down and kind of maybe step back a little bit and say, "Yeah, I mean, in the end, this is not a big deal. Let's just move forward." But that happens all the time too.
I can
Absolutely.
imagine. So, for all our audience out there listening, wanting to know how should they look at an advisor? What's the best way to know who you should work with? I mean, obviously, I mean you're here, so I fully expect you to basically say at least you. But how should the entrepreneur, the team, assess who's the right fit for them? It sounds very personal. It's almost like dating, but I'm curious. What would you recommend?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of somebody who's done it many times is important, who understands the sector and understands also a lot of the buyers, often the executive on a personal level. It's like on Extra, we got really quick responses within days from all the top guys. Versus if you're working with somebody who's newer to the industry and doesn't know all the key decision maker at the large buyers, they might contact somebody else. It might sit there. It might never get there, and so that's a piece. And kind of in the crafting the story, kind of understanding what do people want to hear and what should we leave out, at least not emphasize. That's important. That's a key piece. as you mentioned, is also kind of the personal aspect. You're going to spend a good amount of time with a person over the next 4 to 6 months. So if you don't like him for whatever reason, don't pick that person. Um, Sometimes we saw for like the very large investment bank, you have some of the very senior guys come in at the presentation and then they just hand it off to a junior team. So just making sure people ask, who am I going to work with on a day by day basis? Is it going to be you, or is it going to be a person kind of, two steps down on the totem pole? And so that's an um, important component as well.
And in terms of all this, like just I guess in general, what should people be expecting is the relationship between the company and the advisor? I mean, there's fees to be paid, but what are the ballpark expectations for people? Like, I guess what does this cost in the end?
It really depends. So the way we're compensated, and pretty much any other investment bank, there's typically a modest retainer payment up front, and that could be. It really depends on the company and the stage. It's you know could be 100,000, could be less, could be significantly more. For a lot of deals we work with, we credit that back to the success fee. So it's essentially not an additional payment, but it's for us also a test. Is our client really serious about it? Because advisors typically, at least M&A advisors, are paid based on success. So we in this essentially get a percentage of the deal in the end. Versus lawyers, they get paid by the hour. So, you know, for lawyers, if a deal does not close, they're obviously not happy either, but they still bill their hours. Versus for us, it's we always look at likelihood of a deal closing is a top requirement, a top thing we look at, and that's from that perspective is what are the expectation of the seller? What do you think? Who are the buyers? Who are the buyers at the table? So that's a component, and then yeah, kind of a percentage out of the deal. And if it's an Activision deal, I mean, probably the fee was less than a percent or significant less than a percent. I don't know. And for a small deal, it's a higher percentage. And sometimes fees are structured where you get a certain percentage number to, I don't know, let's say 50 million. And everybody say at 50 million, we would be incredibly happy. This is awesome. But if you get above 50 million, you should get a much higher percentage number too. So sometimes what we call our kickers is if you really exceed expectations, then our client thinks we, together with them, did a really good job and got an exceptional outcome. And then, the percentage numbers for the amount above that increase. So that's how a lot of the deals are structured.
Now, that makes total sense. So I have one last question here as we're wrapping up. Is now the time to sell? I mean, if you're a studio out there and you're making it and you feel like you're there, is the time now?
I would definitely encourage any of the founders, if the studio is doing well, to consider an exit now. Because, I mean, historically, all those deals came in waves. We're the super red hot kind of period now. You know, who knows how things going to be in 4 or 5 years? Um, I think now it's at least, I would encourage everybody to at least have discussions with some of the advisors, let them give you a landscape. What are like the expectations of the outcome? And some entrepreneurs then say, no, I want to go for $1 billion valuation or a 10 billion valuation. I want to build the next Google or Facebook. And others say, look, if I get 40 or 50 million now, I'm going to be pretty happy. And I continue to have a lot of upsides in the future. So it's a personal decision. But I would at least encourage people to make an informed decision now.
Wise words, sir. So how can we follow you, find you? What are your social tags? Let our audience know how can we actually get out to you and reach out to you.
Yeah, so my email is michael.metzger@drakestar.com. You can find me also on the website is Drakestar. If you want to follow me on LinkedIn. I think it's Michael M. Metzger. I post there very regularly all the major events and deals. So feel free to follow me there, or send a message if you want to talk or get some advice. I think those are the main channels I use.
Actually, lad, I had one last question for you. Do you think Microsoft is done, and do you think Sony has to respond?
I think Microsoft is not done, but I think they're going to take their time to the deal needs to close, and it's a big dollar number, and it's going to take a while to close, and then they need to digest it. I mean, they bought Bethesda. The deal closed. Bethesda deal I think closed in March last year, and after that they were, digesting the deal. Uh, will Microsoft probably buy more companies over time? Absolutely yes. It's a little bit of a battle of subscription services, and Game Pass now I think has 25 million subscribers, and Activision, all the content I think will significantly help. I think Activision has about 400 million monthly active users, so if some of them could be converted, that's crucial. Sony is coming up relaunching their own subscription service. I think it's called Spartacus, and I expect Sony to respond. I mean, Sony has been fairly acquisitive. I think they bought like six PC console focused companies last year. That's what I recall now, and they were all a little bit on the smaller side. I mean, definitely compared to Activision, but I would expect them to be fairly acquisitive this year to build up having more unique content. Absolutely.
So the story's not over then. It's only going to get better.
Only going to get better.
Mike, honestly, I appreciate you coming on to Video Games Real Talk with us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and helping us understand this space. You are always welcome to come back. I love those reports you produce, and we will absolutely push them when we get them because they are fun to read. I recommend everyone checking them out. Thank you so much for coming on. It was really interesting and fascinating to speak to you about it. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me.
No problem. And everyone, please stay tuned. Season 3 of Video Games Real Talk is here. We are going to be doing quite a number of things this year, especially in this season, that is going to really blow your minds with some collaborations coming down that I'm very excited to speak to you about. As always, you can find us on videogamesrealtalk.com, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your fine podcasts. Hit us up on Twitter at VGRT or at StarvUp. And of course, share, let your friends know, and tell us what you think. We definitely want to make sure that we're hitting the content the way you want it to be. And we'll see you soon. Take care, everyone.